I have a confession to make. I'm an irredeemable project squirrel. But this has a backstory. Somewhat long and involved backstory. In January, I gave a small private workshop in the Baltimore area at the request of some friends of mine, and it was basically just a lovely 2 days just spent a small group of friends sitting around a dining table sewing. I was flying to Baltimore. I wasn't able to bring a lot in my carry-on. They did offer me to ship some things ahead, but how I feel about these babies is a little unusual. These are my children and I will protect them. So instead of shipping some things up there... Oh, your tassel's out of place. Instead of shipping some things ahead of me, I only brought what I could carry in my carry-on bag, which wasn't much. Thankfully, 2 of my friends, Heather and Jessica, brought more than enough pieces to make up for what I couldn't bring, and they were all original pieces. Get back in place. Why am I doing this on camera? There we go. Peachy purdy. And I spent a good chunk of those 2 days just drooling all over everything that they brought. Sorry, Jessica. Sorry, Heather, for drooling on your stuff. This is all eventually germane to the video that I'm about to get into here, because my friend Jessica brought a number of microbead parasol covers from her collection. These are little 6-ribbed rattan frames. Sometimes they're whalebone, but the cover is entirely made of little tiny glass seed beads, and I have been fascinated with how they're constructed for many years. Being able to examine one of these little bead covers up close was a real treat, and it's just like, how were these made? My friend Kay had a look at one of Jessica's parasols, and she said she thought they were cross-stitched on an open weave linen. And that made my brain think, ooh, I could do this. Right after that 2-day workshop, I took a train to New York City and stayed with my lovely friend Erin. I got to meet some absolutely amazing people. It was a whirlwind of a 48-hour trip to New York City, and my other half and I were supposed to go back in May, and then 2020 decided to become basically purgatory, with no end in sight. Needless to say, I've been spending some of my time quarantined doing research, sometimes until 3 a.m. at night. And it turns out that I actually don't need this open weave linen after all. At least not for this microbead parasol, because it turns out that those were crocheted. And I was like, oh boy, I'm gonna have to learn how to crochet. So this lovely thing behind me is what I refer to as Parasol Narnia. It's an 1850 flame mahogany knockdown wardrobe that my lovely other half David gave to me for Christmas. And despite his insistence that it belonged in the bedroom so that he could see it as well, I took one look at it and I said, this is for parasols. And this thing for parasols is filled with projects that I started, that I planned, that I haven't finished, that are in the process. Some of them have been going on for years. But as I said, I'm an absolute project squirrel, and nothing makes me happier unless I have 50 things going on at once, because I can't focus on one particular thing at one moment, at one time. And I can't ignore those 3 a.m. research nights, because those were intense. So here's where we're at. We're gonna build a parasol frame. We're gonna learn some new skills, like crochet. Then we're gonna add beads. Then we're gonna design some beadwork. Not in this video, but another one. And then someday, if I don't get distracted, but literally the next video I'm planning will be introducing another project, we're gonna do this thing. But first, we need a parasol frame. From what I could find out about these crochet parasol covers, based on the frames that they appear on, it looks like they may have been made anywhere from the late 1830s into the end of the 1860s. Some museum collections have them dated to the early part of the 19th century. And while I don't disagree that that's possible, if you look at the frames that these things are on, many of them definitely would appear to date later than that, as in 1830s, 1850s, 1860s. And the 1800 to 1810 dating that I've been seeing doesn't really jive with what I know 1800 to 1810 parasols looking like. But research is a fluid, ever-changing thing, so I could be completely wrong. And I may be coming back 3 months from now, 3 years from now, however long, and say, oh, I was wrong. But such is the nature of research. So with all of that, let's talk about the parasol frame that we're going to be building. I'm using pieces that were left to me by my wonderful mentor, Marta Vincent, who knew I could make use of her basket case parasols. A lot of these were just stems and handles with no stretchers or ribs, so I don't feel bad modifying some of them if needed, as I did with the selected frame. I've selected this blonde wood frame that would date to around 1860, carved with this bamboo turning, based on its similarity to a couple examples I have in my source file. What sets these apart from normal parasol frames is their use of 6 rather than 8 ribs. To support those ribs, we're going to need some stretchers. Thankfully, I have a good supply of salvage stretchers to pull from. I only had about 4 stretchers that were the length I needed and 2 broken ones that were close, so these will be cut down and re-drilled to make a set of 6. Someday, I'll learn how to make these from scratch so I don't have to modify existing parts. Alright, what was I doing? Prepare yourself for some really unpleasant drilling noises, brought to you by my great-grandfather's hand drill. Next, rattan. Rattan is selected for ribs based on its size and density, so that they should be fairly easy to make all the same flexibility. Manufacturers had ways of getting the frame to round out consistently, and I have a way of dealing with that myself, but that part is secret. Rattan ribs are shaved on 3 sides to make them a roughly square shape. On original examples, the skin of the rattan is left in place on the top of the rib, and I think this has something to do with maintaining the spring back of the rattan. In the mid-19th century, larger American factories would use these shavings, as well as shavings from their carving and turning rooms, as fuel and kindling for their furnaces, or, if their machinery was powered by steam, boilers. With 6 equally weighted and prepared ribs, we are now ready for gits. The gits, which are narrow strips of thin brass sheet, are folded over the stretchers using a flat-nosed plier. On original pieces, you see both brass and a weirdly silver-foiled metal sheeting used, but brass is what I can get at my favorite hardware store, which one day I will take footage in because it is literally a giant turn-of-the-20th century funhouse of a building. But I digress. We mark the ribs to take the gits at the hinge. I forgot to film drilling these. But I did remember to film drilling at the head wire. So everyone gets to experience their favorite sound, which is drilling. To keep the frame opening and closing smoothly, the headwire ends of the ribs are rounded with a rasp. There's a train going by, and you might hear it in the background, but it's about 1:30 in the morning, and all we have to do is thread all these, shape the ends, drill the ends, and then mount them to the frame. So tomorrow. Soft wire was used to threadle the ribs, which refers to attaching the stretchers and the ribs together. Once the ribs are threadled, the cut wire ends are spread flat with a ball peen hammer. The rib tips on this frame will be brought to a blunted end to match the construction of original frames for these beaded covers. Then the ends are drilled to accept the cover. Before I can assemble the frame, though, I have to do some more drilling on the stem, as this frame was modified in length, so we need to drill for the head wire and for the upper pin of the hinge. Next,
we wire the frame together. The procedure for wiring this frame follows the same as wiring together an 8-rib frame, but we're only using 6 ribs, so instead of the normal 4 on one side of the head wire, we will have 3, and then the other 3 ribs will be on the opposing side. The most difficult part of the process is wiring the ribs to the slide. The slide on this frame is notched for 8 ribs, but we're going to use 6 of the slots. Original frames for the microbead covers had slides notched specifically for 6 ribs, but I only have this, so we're winging it. Also, I can never figure out what was done first in the period, wiring the ribs together at the head wire or at the slide. Either way, it's never, ever easy.
This part is always so tricky. I have it looped wrong. Stay. Stay there. Nope. 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 No. Ah! Listen to me. Alright, children. There we go.
With the frame wired together, the frame is essentially complete. I'm still not sure what finial I'm going to be using for this one, but I have a feeling I may haul the lathe out sometime and actually turn and carve a new one, but the jury is still out on that. My original thought was to build a bone frame for this, but I just liked the blonde wood better, and I felt it would work better with the warmer, richer color palette I have planned for the beading. Now, onto patterning.
So I know that the overall length is 7.5 inches because that's the length that I cut the ribs to, or at least the length to the point where I attach the rib to the cover. But I changed my measurement here to make the dome shape more what I wanted, so now I have to measure that. So you are probably going to have to be measured in metric. Second thought, I should have done this while the ribs were off the frame. Maybe inches is better for this. 3 1/4. Okay, so here's the tricky part. This method usually works for an 8-ribbed frame, whereas we're dealing with a 6-ribbed frame here. So I think there's going to be some math involved. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm not very good at math. So I think I found a method that will work to divide this square into the angles to make a triangle for a 6-ribbed frame. Basically it involves a compass. You draw a radius on one side or in one corner, then you center the compass on the radius you just drew and draw another radius to intersect with that. If you were dividing it into 3, you would make another one somewhere else. I don't math. In theory, you can't really see the lines on this camera, but in theory, where those indents that I made with that compass should be the equivalent of 60 degrees from here to here. Maybe? Possibly? We'll see. Okay. Three and a quarter. Oh, that's crazy. I'm sure by math standards this will make sense, but when you measure the rib length, which is this line here,
you mark it on this angle here, which is 60 degrees, it comes out the same length on this side, which makes me wonder if I just drew a proportional triangle or something. A triangle of even sides. Maybe I did. I don't know math. That was the subject I failed. English and history was more my specialty. Math was like, not so much. So here she is. Here's the pattern for this little bead parasol. It is probably the tiniest pattern that I have ever drafted. It's ridiculously small. It's only going to get a little bit smaller as I do my tweaks to it. But this is the basic pattern. It's a little weird, but we'll run a cotton mock-up and see if it works. And then will come the most arduous task, I feel, of this whole process, which will be learning to crochet. I'll get into the research side of things on this project a little later, but for now I'm just thinking how much I'm dreading learning crochet. Oh Lord. With the pattern done, and this being not the typical frame that I usually build, I just want to run a mock-up to see if the pattern is correct. The panels of the mock-up are cut like you would a solid color cover, with the pattern flipping to conserve material. Being a mock-up, we're just marking it in ink. I draft my patterns without seam allowance as I find it easier to sew along these lines for the most accurate fit. I just cut between my sewing lines when I mark it on the material that I'm using. As with a hand-sewn cover of the period, the seams are sewn with a running stitch. When I sew an actual cover on my next project, I'll get more into this and why that's important, but briefly, it's important that the seam has stretch to it, and a running stitch provides you with stretch. Now, normally I'm confident enough in my pattern drafting abilities that I can cut a cover without running a mock-up, but I always recommend cutting a mock-up if you're going to try it out yourself. But being that this is an unusual frame and not the typical cover panel that I draft, I want to test it. If I'm ever drafting patterns for pagoda frames or doing a cover that will have some kind of embroidery or a really unusual style of cover, I always do a mock-up. Nothing is more disappointing than doing a lot of work on your cover panels, then you put them together and suddenly the whole cover doesn't fit the frame. I try to avoid that disappointment as much as possible. So mock-ups are important, y'all. With the mock-up sewn, it is fastened to the frame with a small gathering stitch at the head wire to keep the mock-up snugly at the stem, and it's attached to the rib tips with safety pins. The other use of the mock-up will be so that I can confirm the shape that I'm going to be using for the panel so that I can grid it out and eventually use it to determine the rows of thousands and thousands and thousands of beads that I'll have to string and in what sequence. All these things to look forward to. To adjust the dome shape with a mock-up, I use pins to take a small dart out of the center of each panel. This is an easy, fast way to determine the dome depth that you want for your final cover. So once you're pleased with the shape of the dome, you keep the dart folded with the pin partly removed and measure that folded dart to give you the exact amount to take off each side of the baseline. So after taking those little bits out with the pins, which is my little trick to adjusting dome shape, I'm actually really happy with the depth of this dome. These little bead covers were usually not terribly deep. They were quite shallow, but not flat, typically. I think it will be time to look at doing some design of crochet. I did have to wrestle with the cover quite a bit, which resulted in one of the seams popping, which is a little bit concerning. Really, this pattern is only going to be used as the base for what will be the crochet design. The only silk that it's going to be used for is going to be the lining, and linings are much stretchier than taffeta covers. And I think the crochet cover is going to have a bit more flexibility than what a taffeta cover would, and that's usually why you see a sewn-on fringe around the edge, just to keep it from stretching out over time. I'm not hugely worried about the crochet being too tight, but a tiny bit concerned with the lining, but I think it'll be alright. So, anyway, on we go to doing some beadwork designs, which means confronting my nemesis, the blank page. We have built a frame, we've drafted a pattern, we made a mock-up. That means the next step is twofold: learning crochet and practicing until I have crocheted enough dish towels and tiny samples to fill a warehouse, and designing the cover. That will be for another video though, because I want to go over design books, ladies magazines, textiles, beads, research, and stuff, and more stuff, and stuff that goes into my design process. Thank you for joining me on another excursion into my little parasol-obsessed world. Like, subscribe, and all that delightful YouTube-y stuff.